I'll be your wife if you let me stay. The pregnant peasant begged the prince for shelter. The gates slammed shut as thunder rolled. A poor woman, heavy with child, fell to her knees in the mud, her voice breaking through the storm. The prince could have turned away. Any other man of rank would have. But when her words echoed across the courtyard, every noble heart froze. Inside the hall, candles flickered and whispers spread. A peasant daring to bargain with a crown? Scandal enough to ruin an entire house. Yet what no one knew, what the prince himself would soon learn, was that her past held a secret tied to his own darkest guilt dot as nobles plotted. As duty called, as her child quickened within her one. Choice would change a kingdom forever. Will the prince cast her aside to save his crown, or defy the world for the woman who asked only for shelter? Asterisk, I'd love to know. Where are you watching from? Type it down below, and while you're here, subscribe so you'll always catch the next story. The storm howled across the darkened countryside like a hungry beast, pelting Clara with icy rain that soaked through her thin wool cloak. Each step was a battle against the sucking mud and howling wind, but she forced herself onward, one hand pressed protectively over her swollen belly. Her child stirred within, as if sensing her desperation. "Just a bit further, little one," she whispered, though her words were torn away by the tempest. The Lord will provide shelter, as he promises in his word. The memory of her late husband's family's cruel words still stung fresh in her mind. Beggar woman, they had called her, carrying a dead soldier's burden. They had slammed their door in her face, leaving her with nowhere to turn as night fell. Lightning split the sky, illuminating a grand hunting lodge ahead through the sheets of rain. Clara's heart leaped at the sight of warm torchlight flickering in the windows. The royal banner snapped in the wind atop the highest tower. This was Prince Edmund's private retreat, where he came to escape the pressures of court life. Her sodden skirts weighed heavy as she stumbled the final distance to the gates. 2 guards stood watch, their cloaks whipping about them in the wind as they raised their torches higher. "Stay back," the first guard ordered, his hand moving to his sword hilt. "This is royal property." Clara's legs trembled beneath her as she drew closer. "Please," she begged, her voice breaking. "I seek only shelter from the storm. Begone, vagrant." The second guard commanded. "This is no place for your kind." The weight of exhaustion and despair proved too much. Clara's knees buckled, and she collapsed to the muddy ground, one hand still cradling her unborn child. Tears mingled with the rain on her cheeks as she looked up at the impassive guards. "I'll be your wife if you let me stay," she cried out in desperate inspiration, knowing she had nothing else to offer. "I can cook and clean, tend herbs and gardens. I know my letters and scripture. Please, I beg you, if not for my sake, then for my innocent child." The guards exchanged uncertain glances, clearly unmoved by her plea. "On your way, woman, before we—" The thunder of hoofbeats cut through their words as a mounted figure emerged from the darkness. Clara's heart nearly stopped as she recognized the proud bearing and fine clothes of Prince Edmund himself. Returning from a late ride despite the storm, the prince drew his mount to a sharp halt, water streaming from his cape. As he stared down at the scene before him, his stern features showed clear shock at finding a heavily pregnant woman prostrate in the mud before his gates. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his commanding voice carrying even over the howling wind. "Your Highness," the first guard said with a hasty bow. "This vagrant woman—" "I heard her words," Prince Edmund cut him off, his penetrating gaze fixed on Clara's huddled form. Something flickered in his expression, perhaps pity, or something deeper that Clara dared not name. "Please, Your Highness," she whispered, bowing her head. "I have nowhere else to turn." For a long moment, only the sound of the storm filled the tense silence. Then, Prince Edmund swung down from his horse with fluid grace, handing the reins to one of the startled guards. "Bring her inside," he ordered sharply. "At once." "But your highness," the second guard protested. "Protocol demands. Would you have me leave a woman with child to die in this tempest?" Prince Edmund's voice cracked like thunder. "I said bring her inside. Now." The guards scrambled to obey, though Clara could see the reluctance in their movements as they helped her to her feet. Her legs shook so badly she could barely stand, but she forced herself to stay upright, clutching her belly protectively. Prince Edmund watched with an unreadable expression as the guards supported her toward the lodge's entrance. Though he said nothing more, Clara felt the weight of his gaze following her every step. Despite her fear and exhaustion, a tiny spark of hope kindled in her heart. Perhaps God had led her here for a purpose, to this most unlikely of shelters. Thunder rolled overhead as the heavy wooden doors swung open, spilling warm lamplight into the storm-tossed night. Clara crossed the threshold on trembling legs, leaving muddy footprints on the fine stone floor. Whatever fate awaited her inside, she silently prayed it would be kinder than the storm she left behind. The guards half-dragged, half-guided Clara through the heavy oak doors of the hunting lodge. Warmth from the great hearth washed over her shivering form, but the hostile stares of servants and nobles alike chilled her to the bone. Her soaked clothes dripped steadily onto the polished wooden floors, each drop seeming to echo in the sudden hush that fell over the hall. A peasant woman in the prince's own lodge, whispered one finely dressed lady to another, hiding her sneer behind a silk fan. And in such a condition, Clara's cheeks burned with shame as she felt dozens of eyes taking in her mud-caked shoes, the simple homespun dress that clung to her swollen belly, and her sodden cloak that had once been sturdy wool but now hung in bedraggled folds. Yet she kept her chin lifted, drawing strength from the scripture verses she had memorized in happier days. "The Lord is my shepherd," she whispered under her breath. "I shall not want." Prince Edmund stood before the roaring fireplace, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the floor. Though his face remained stern, something flickered in his dark eyes as he studied her, perhaps pity or curiosity at her bold declaration at the gates. "Your Grace," Clara managed, attempting a curtsy despite her condition. Her legs trembled with exhaustion, and she stumbled slightly. "Bring her a chair," Edmund commanded, and a servant hurried to comply. "You may rest here tonight, woman. Christian charity demands no less in such weather." His voice was deep and measured, carrying the weight of authority earned rather than merely inherited. "Thank you, Your Grace," Clara breathed, sinking gratefully onto the wooden seat. "God will surely bless your kindness." A ripple of muttered conversation swept through the gathered courtiers. Several ladies drew back their skirts, as if her common status might somehow soil their fine silks. A servant girl brought Clara a cup of warm cider, but before she could take it, a sharp voice cut through the murmuring crowd. "Really, Cousin Edmund, have you taken leave of your senses?" Lady Beatrice glided forward, her emerald gown rustling with each precise step. Her beautiful face was twisted with disdain as she gestured toward Clara. "To shelter such a creature, and in your private lodge, no less. What will people say?" "They will say I showed mercy to one in need," Edmund replied coolly, but Lady Beatrice was not finished. "Mercy? Ha!" She laughed, a brittle sound devoid of warmth. "They will say you've lost all sense of propriety. A common woman, heavy with who knows whose child, permitted to soil these halls with her presence. Your reputation will be in tatters by morning." Her voice carried deliberately through the room, ensuring every ear caught her words. Clara's hands tightened around the warm cup, but she did not bow her head in shame. Instead, she closed her eyes briefly and offered a silent prayer of gratitude. "Thank you, Lord, for this shelter from the storm, whatever thorns may come with it." The prince's expression darkened at his cousin's words, and he stepped forward, commanding attention without raising his voice. "Enough, Beatrice. I have made my decision." Servants began laying out the evening meal on the long table, the normal chatter of such preparations muted by the tension in the air. Clara remained in her chair by the fire, acutely aware of her mud-stained clothing amid the fine velvets and silks surrounding her. Lady Beatrice took her place at the table, shooting venomous glances in Clara's direction, while whispering furiously to her companion's Dot as the household assembled for supper. Prince Edmund remained standing. He raised his goblet, and silence fell. Immediately, "My good people," he began, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall, "you have all heard this woman's extraordinary offer at our gates, to be my wife in exchange for shelter." He paused, and Clara felt her heart skip a beat as every eye in the room turned to her. Some would say such an offer from one of her station is an insult to our noble house. His gaze swept the assembly, lingering pointedly on Lady Beatrice. "But I say this, let us see whether her heart proves worthier than fine lineage." Gasps erupted throughout the hall. Lady Beatrice's face turned white with fury, her fingers clenching around her knife. Clara sat perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe as the implications of the prince's words washed over her like a wave. Dawn's pale light crept through the small window of the servants' quarters, rousing Clara from her fitful sleep. The rough blanket scratched against her skin as she sat up on the narrow cot, one hand instinctively cradling her swollen belly. The events of the previous night felt like a fever dream, but the unfamiliar surroundings confirmed their reality. The smell of yeast and flour drew her toward the kitchen. There she found the cook Mary, already kneading dough with strong, weathered hands. Without a word, Clara rolled up her sleeves and began working alongside her. Mary's suspicious glance softened slightly at Clara's skilled movements. "You know, your way around bread, then?" Mary asked, her tone guarded but not unkind. "My mother taught me well," Clara replied softly, focusing on the familiar motions that brought comfort even in this strange place. "The secret is in how gentle you are with the dough." As the morning progressed, more servants filtered into the kitchen. They kept their distance at first, but Clara's quiet competence and willingness to work gradually earned their cautious acceptance. She learned their names, their duties, the rhythm of the lodge's daily life. From his study window, Prince Edmund watched the courtyard below, where Clara now hung linens on a line, her movements careful despite her condition. His dark eyes narrowed thoughtfully as he observed her easy manner with the servants, so different from the desperate woman who had appeared at his gates. A commotion near the kennels drew his attention. His prized hunting hound, Brutus, had torn open an old wound, and the animal's pained howls echoed across the yard. Edmund hurried down, finding the lodge physician struggling to approach the agitated dog. Clara appeared beside them, her voice gentle. "May I help, Your Highness?" Without waiting for permission, she knelt carefully beside the frightened animal. "There now, brave one," she murmured, allowing Brutus to smell her hand. The dog's growls subsided as she stroked his head. From her apron pocket, she produced dried herbs. "Yarrow for the bleeding and chamomile to soothe him," she explained, crushing the leaves into a poultice. The physician watched with grudging interest as she applied the mixture to the wound. Within moments, Brutus relaxed under her touch. "Where did you learn such skills?" Edmund asked, unable to hide his curiosity. "From the village wise woman, Your Highness. She taught me to read herbs and tend wounds." Clara kept her eyes lowered, but her voice held quiet confidence. As evening approached, Clara carried fresh linens past the library. Voices from within made her pause, the Duke's envoys speaking in hushed but urgent tones. "This common woman threatens everything." One sighed. The alliance with Duke Rochester's daughter must proceed. Think of the armies it would unite, the lands it would secure. Indeed, another replied, Prince Edmund cannot be distracted by some peasant's foolish offer. The marriage contract must be signed within the month. Clara's heart thundered in her chest. She had known, of course, that her desperate plea could not truly be considered. Yet hearing their cold calculations, treating lives and hearts like mere coins to be traded, brought tears to her eyes-dotted supper. Clara served quietly alongside the other maids, trying to ignore the weighing stares of the nobles. Prince Edmund sat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable as ever. The Duke's envoys flanked him, their smiles not reaching their eyes. Suddenly, Edmund's voice cut through the murmur of conversation. I have made a decision regarding our unexpected guest. The hall fell silent. Clara's hands trembled as she clutched a serving tray. This woman offered herself as my wife in exchange for shelter. His tone carried a hint of mockery that made several nobles titter. While some might dismiss such presumption outright, I find myself curious. He turned his penetrating gaze toward Clara. Very well. If this peasant woman dares think herself fit for such vows, she shall be judged by her conduct. Gasps and whispers erupted around the hall. Clara stood frozen, her face burning with both shame and determination. She understood his game. She would be tested, scrutinized, likely humiliated. But as she met Prince Edmund's challenging stare, she lifted her chin slightly. For her child's sake, she would endure whatever trials lay ahead. The Duke's envoys exchanged dark looks, their earlier plots clearly disturbed by this unexpected development. Clara could feel their hostile gazes boring into her back as she continued her serving duties, knowing that her very presence had become a threat to their carefully laid plans. Clara moved through her days at the hunting lodge like a quiet shadow, her gentle presence gradually weaving itself into the fabric of daily life. In the kennels, she spent hours tending to Thor, the prince's favorite hunting hound, who had torn his leg on a wild boar hunt. Her skilled hands mixed poultices of herbs, and her soft voice seemed to calm the animal's restless whimpers. There. Now, brave fellow, she murmured, carefully wrapping the dog's leg while the kennel master looked on with grudging approval. You'll be running again soon enough. In the kitchens, she proved herself invaluable, turning simple ingredients into hearty meals that even the nobles praised, though they did so quietly, when they thought no one was listening. The gardens, too, flourished under her care, as she remembered her mother's teachings about which plants aided healing and which brought flavor to food. But always, there were eyes watching. Ladies tittered behind their fans, and lords made sharp comments just loud enough for her to hear. Clara bore it all with the same quiet dignity that had caught Prince Edmund's attention that stormy night. It was in the herb garden where the prince first sought her out, drawn perhaps by the peaceful atmosphere she created there. Clara knelt among the plants, her skirts spread around her, when his shadow fell across her work. You've brought order to this neglected corner, Edmund observed, studying the neat rows of herbs. Clara looked up, shielding her eyes from the sun. These plants need little from us, Your Highness. They ask only for water and care, and in return, they heal our sick and feed our hungry. They serve without complaint. Edmund's brow furrowed. You speak of service often, because it is the heart of true nobility, Clara replied, her voice gentle but firm. Greatness lies not in what others do for us, but in what we do for others. The prince shifted uncomfortably, unused to such direct speech. You presume to lecture me on nobility? I speak only what I believe to be true, Clara answered, returning to her work. Even Christ washed the feet of his disciples. Her words stayed with Edmund long after he left the garden, echoing in his mind during tedious council meetings and elaborate dinners. It was at one such dinner that Lady Beatrice chose to make her move. The great hall buzzed with conversation as nobles from neighboring estates dined at the prince's table. Clara sat at the far end, as her position demanded, but her presence was like a splinter in Lady Beatrice's eye. "Tell us, peasant," Lady Beatrice called out, her voice cutting through the din. "What name shall you give your beggar's brat? Something common, I suppose, to match its station." The hall fell silent. Clara felt all eyes turned to her, some curious, some cruel, some merely embarrassed by the display. She placed her hand protectively over her belly and rose slowly to her feet. "My child," she said, her voice clear and steady, "will be named for its father, who died serving this kingdom. And though we may lack wealth, we are rich in God's grace." She smiled gently at Lady Beatrice. "For as it is written, 'Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth.'" The silence deepened. Lady Beatrice's face flushed red, but she found no words to counter the simple dignity of Clara's response. Several of the older nobles nodded approvingly, and one elderly duchess was seen to dab at her eyes with a handkerchief. Later that night, Edmund sat alone in his study, watching the fire dance in the hearth. The woman he had allowed to stay, thinking to expose her presumption, had instead exposed something in himself. Her words about service haunted him, as did the quiet grace with which she faced Beatrice's cruelty. He remembered how she had knelt in the mud that first night, desperate, but never begging. How she worked without complaint, healing and helping wherever she went. How the servants spoke of her kindness, and how even his beloved hound trusted her gentle hands dot in the flickering firelight. Edmund admitted to himself that what he felt, when he watched her in the garden, was not the satisfaction of testing a presumptuous peasant, but something far more dangerous to his carefully ordered world. Something that made his heart beat faster when she spoke her simple truths. Something that made him want to be worthy of the nobility she saw in service rather than status. The prince stared into the flames, unsettled by the warmth that filled his chest whenever he thought of Clara's quiet strength and gentle wisdom. The crisp morning air filled the servants' hall as Clara sat with young Mary, the scullery maid, their heads bent over a weathered book of psalms. Clara's finger traced the words slowly, her voice gentle as she guided the girl through the verses. "The Lord is my shepherd." Mary stumbled over the words, her face screwed up in concentration. "I shall not ... one. That's right, Clara." Encouraged, her own hand resting on her swollen belly. "You're learning so quickly." From the doorway, the chaplain paused, watching the impromptu lesson with growing interest. He had initially viewed Clara with suspicion, but seeing her patient instruction of the younger staff had begun to soften his heart. "Most impressive," he said, stepping into the room. "Few take the time to help others find their way to God's word." Clara dipped her head respectfully. "We all deserve the chance to read his wisdom for ourselves, Father." The days had settled into a rhythm at the hunting lodge. While many of the nobles still regarded her with disdain, the servants had begun to warm to Clara's quiet strength and willing hands. She never shirked from work, despite her condition, and always had a kind word or helpful suggestion for those around her. One afternoon, as Clara brought fresh water to the stables, she found Prince Edmund brushing down his stallion. The sight of him, jacket removed and sleeves rolled up, caught her off guard. He looked almost common in that moment, more man than prince. "Your Grace," she curtsied, careful with the heavy bucket. "Here, let me." Edmund moved to take the water from her, their fingers brushing momentarily. "You shouldn't strain yourself." I've managed worse," Clara said softly, but allowed him to help Dot as they worked together. Spreading fresh straw and filling water troughs, Edmund broke the comfortable silence. "Tell me of your husband." Clara's hand stilled. "Thomas was a good man, a loyal soldier." Her voice grew thick with memory. He loved to sing hymns while he worked, had the sweetest voice I'd ever heard. The charges against him ... She shook her head. They made no sense. He would never have betrayed his oath. Edmund's face grew shadowed, his movements becoming mechanical. The execution had happened under his authority. Clara realized, though she'd never connected it before. The air between them grew heavy with unspoken words. Later that afternoon, Clara stood tending the great hearth in the main hall, adding logs to keep the chill at bay. The heat and exertion suddenly overwhelmed her, and the room began to spin. She swayed, reaching for support. "Clara!" Edmund's voice cut through her dizziness as strong hands caught her shoulders. He had been watching her from his chair, she realized, though she hadn't noticed his presence. As he steadied her, his hand brushed against her rounded belly. In that moment, the child within her kicked strongly, as if greeting the touch. Edmund's eyes widened in wonder, his hand lingering. "The babe is active today," Clara whispered, her cheeks flushing at their proximity. "Sit," Edmund commanded gently, leading her to a nearby chair. "You must rest more." As twilight painted the sky in soft purples and blues, Edmund found Clara in the garden. She stood among the herb beds, her face peaceful as she breathed in the evening air. Without speaking, he fell into step beside her as she walked the gravel paths. They paused beneath a flowering apple tree, its pale blossoms drifting down around them like snow. Edmund's hand reached out, hesitant at first, then settled with surprising tenderness on her belly. God's greatest miracles often come in the humblest packages, Clara said softly, covering his hand with her own. "Even the lowest of us have a place in his plan." Edmund's throat worked as he struggled with emotion, his usual stern demeanor cracking. "Perhaps," he said roughly, "I have much to learn about true nobility." Clara smiled gently, watching the last light fade from the sky. In that quiet moment, surrounded by the sweet scent of apple blossoms, something shifted between them, as delicate and profound as a prayer whispered in the dark. The morning sun had barely risen when hoofbeats echoed. Through the courtyard, a messenger, dusty from hard riding, dismounted before the great doors of the hunting lodge. His livery bore the crest of the neighboring duchy, and his bearing spoke of urgent business. Clara watched from the kitchen window as Prince Edmund emerged to receive the message, his face growing more serious with each line he read. The messenger bowed deeply, awaiting a response. "His Grace appears troubled," whispered Beth, one of the kitchen maids, as she kneaded bread beside Clara. "They say the Duke's daughter has been expecting word of courtship these past months." Clara's hands stilled on the herbs she was sorting. She had known this day would come, yet the reality of it struck her heart like a physical blow. Through the window, she could see Edmund pacing the courtyard. The message crumpled in his fist. As the days passed, whispers filled the corridors of the lodge. Clara could not escape them, try as she might. Some of the servants regarded her with pitying eyes, while others barely concealed their scorn. "Poor thing," she overheard Cook saying to the housekeeper. "She'll be cast out soon enough, mark my words. The Duke's daughter won't stand for competition, even from a peasant." "She brought it on herself," replied the housekeeper tartly, thinking she could rise above her station. "And in her condition, no less." Clara pressed her hands to her belly, drawing strength from the child within. The babe kicked strongly, as if sensing her distress. She had endured worse than whispers before, she told herself. Yet the thought of leaving the lodge, leaving Edmund, made her heart ache in ways she hadn't expected. One evening, as shadows lengthened across the garden paths, Clara found Edmund alone by the fish pond. He stood with his hands clasped, behind his back, lost in thought. The weight of expectation seemed to bow his proud shoulders. "Your Grace," she said softly, moving to stand beside him. "Clara." His voice held warmth, despite his troubled expression. I fear I have not been fair to you, allowing you to stay when I knew ... double quotes. He trailed off, shaking his head. Life seldom follows the path we expect, Clara replied. She gathered courage, knowing she must speak now or never. I learned that when they took my Thomas. Edmund turned to face her, his brow furrowed. Your husband? Yes. Clara's fingers twisted in her apron. He was a soldier in your army, Your Grace. Thomas Miller was his name. They executed him 3 years ago, accused of plotting against the crown. Her voice trembled but held firm. He was innocent. The color drained from Edmund's face. His hands, reaching instinctively toward her, fell limply to his sides. Thomas Miller, he whispered, the name clearly familiar to him. You remember him? Clara asked, hope and dread mingling in her chest. Double quotes, Edmund's voice was hoarse. I signed the order. Lord Blackthorne brought me the evidence himself, he said. He pressed a hand to his forehead. Dear God, I was barely more than a boy, new to my authority. I trusted my advisors. Clara felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Though she had suspected, having the truth confirmed made her knees weak. Then it was by your word that my Thomas died. Edmund's eyes held such anguish that Clara nearly reached for him, despite her own pain. I was wrong, he whispered. Lord Blackthorne was later exposed for his corruption, but it was too late for so many. I cannot. He stepped back from her, his face closing off like shutters against a storm. I cannot bear this guilt. Your Grace, Clara pleaded, but Edmund was already turning away. His steps hurried and uneven as he fled into the gathering. Dusk left alone by the pond, Clara finally allowed her tears to fall. They slid silently down her cheeks as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. All her hopes, so carefully guarded, seemed to crumble like autumn leaves. A cool breeze stirred the water, rippling the pond's surface until the reflected stars shattered into 1,000 glittering pieces. Clara wrapped her arms around herself, around her unborn child, feeling more alone than she had even on that stormy night when she'd first arrived at the lodge's gates. Oh, Thomas, she whispered to the night air. What am I to do now? No answer came, save for the lonely call of an owl and the soft rustle of leaves in the darkness. The great hall buzzed with conversation as nobles and clergy gathered for the grand supper. Candlelight flickered across fine silk gowns and jeweled rings, while servants moved silently between the tables, bearing platters of roasted meats and warm bread. Clara sat quietly at the far end, keeping her eyes lowered as whispers followed. Her every movement. Lady Beatrice's voice suddenly cut through the murmur of dinner conversation like a knife. Your Grace, she called out, rising from her seat near Edmund. How long will you allow this deception to continue? Her face wore a cruel smile as she pointed at Clara. This woman who appeared at your gates is nothing but a manipulator. A child is illegitimate. She admits herself she was a soldier's wife, yet arrives months after his death, heavy with child. Gasps echoed through the hall. Clara's hands trembled in her lap as nobles turned to stare at her with fresh contempt. For the sake of your dignity, your Grace, one elderly baron called out, you must proceed with the Duke's daughter. This arrangement has gone on long enough. Indeed. Another noble joined in. Think of your position, your Grace. The alliance must be secured. Edmund sat rigid in his chair, his face a mask of conflict. His eyes met Clara's briefly before dropping to the table, his silence speaking volumes. Clara rose slowly, her heart pounding but her voice steady. My Thomas was a good man, she declared, facing the hostile crowd. He died with honor, though falsely accused. I came here seeking only shelter for his child, not power or position. Her hand rested protectively over her swollen belly. I would rather sleep in ditches than purchase comfort with false words. The hall fell silent at her dignity, but Lady Beatrice's laughter shattered the moment. How noble our little beggar sounds. Shall we all applaud her performance? Tears threatened, but Clara held them back as she quietly left the hall, ignoring the mixed murmurs of pity and scorn that followed her retreat. In her small chamber near the servants' quarters, Clara finally allowed her tears to fall as she pulled out her worn traveling bag. By candlelight, she carefully folded her few belongings, the shawl Thomas had given her, her prayer book, a spare dress. Her presence had brought only pain to this house. She thought bitterly. It would be better to leave at first light, before she could cause Edmund any more difficulty. The candle guttered as she wept, casting strange shadows on the walls of what would be her last night of shelter. The pale morning light crept through the castle windows, casting long shadows across the stone floors. Clara moved slowly through the servants' passage, her swollen feet aching with each step. Her small bundle of belongings felt heavy in her trembling hands, though it contained little more than a dress and her herbs. Tears traced silent paths down her cheeks as she passed the kitchen where she had baked bread, the garden where she had tended herbs, and the kennels where she had healed the hound. Each place held memories of small kindnesses and quiet hopes now lost dot above. On the carved stone balcony overlooking the courtyard, Prince Edmund stood motionless. Dark circles beneath his eyes betrayed his sleepless night. He watched Clara's slow progress through the early morning mist, her pregnant form moving carefully across the cobblestones. Her words from the previous night echoed in his mind. I sought only shelter for my child. The simple truth of it struck him anew. While others schemed for power and position, she had asked merely for safety. Her dignity in the face of cruelty shamed him, as did his own cowardly silence. The clatter of hooves and carriage wheels broke the morning quiet. The Duke's envoys had arrived early, their elaborate coach gleaming with polish and brass. Edmund's hands clenched the balcony rail as he watched them descend, already calling for his presence with imperious voices. Your Grace must commit today, the senior envoy announced as he swept into the castle. The Duke's daughter awaits only your word to begin the marriage arrangements. Think of the advantages, lands, armies, alliances. Edmund stood rigid, watching Clara approach the gate where he had first found her. The weight of duty pressed upon him like chains. Duty to crown, to politics, to advantage. Yet in that moment, he saw with sudden clarity how such a marriage would forever betray not only Clara's courage, but his own conscience. No, he whispered, then louder. No! He turned from the startled envoys and rushed toward the grand staircase, taking the steps two at a time. His heart pounded with a silent vow. He would not lose her, not to politics, not to pride, not to his own fear of choosing love over duty. The great hall blazed with candlelight as nobles gathered for the evening feast. Tapestries cast long shadows on the stone walls, and the air hung heavy with tension. Clara sat at the far edge of the hall, her face pale as milk, her simple dress a stark contrast to the silk and jewels that adorned the court ladies. Her bundle lay ready beside her chair, a silent testament to her intended departure. The Duke's envoys stood near the high table, their dark robes like storm clouds gathering. Lord Geoffrey, the elder envoy, stepped forward with a scroll in hand. Your Highness, we must press for your answer regarding the alliance. The Duke's daughter awaits your courtship with great anticipation. Murmurs of approval rippled through the assembled nobles. Lady Beatrice's voice rose above the rest. Indeed, such a match would bring great strength to both houses. Edmund sat, silent in his carved chair, his fingers tight around his goblet. His gaze drifted to Clara, who kept her eyes downcast, her hands folded protectively over her swollen belly. The sight of her quiet dignity, even now, stirred something deep within his heart. With deliberate grace, Edmund rose to his feet. The hall fell silent, every eye fixed upon their prince. "My lords and ladies," his voice rang clear and strong. Across the chamber, "You speak to me of lineage, of wealth, of political advantage. You counsel me to seek a bride of noble birth." He paused, his gaze sweeping the hall. "But I have seen greater nobility in one whom you despise. I have witnessed more grace in her simple faith than in all your grand ceremonies." His eyes found Clara, who looked up at last, her face filled with wonder. "I will wed Clara, for she has shown the heart of a queen." Gasps echoed off the stone walls. Lady Beatrice's fan clattered to the floor. The Duke's envoys stood frozen in disbelief. From the shadows stepped Father Thomas, the aged chaplain, his weathered face serene. "Your Highness, by law and holy church, with proper banns or license, such a marriage may indeed proceed." The prince descended from the dais, his steps measured and sure. He crossed to where Clara sat, trembling like a leaf in autumn. With gentle reverence, he took her hand in his, raising it to his lips before the stunned assembly. The candlelight caught the tears in Clara's eyes as she gazed up at him, hope blooming like a flower after winter's frost. The great hall blazed with candlelight, illuminating the faces of dozens of nobles gathered for the evening feast. Tapestries rustled against stone walls as servants hurried between tables, bearing platters of roasted meats and fresh bread. The scent of beeswax and wood smoke mingled with the rich aromas of the feast. Clara sat at the far edge of the lowest table, her simple gray dress a stark contrast to the fine silks and velvets surrounding her. Her face was pale, and her trembling hands remained folded in her lap, though she had packed her belongings, ready to slip away at first light. The prince's steward had insisted she attend this final meal. The Duke's envoys sat in places of honor, near Prince Edmund, their rich doublets gleaming with gold thread. Their faces held the smug satisfaction of men certain of victory. The elder envoy raised his gilded goblet, his voice carrying across the hall. "Your Highness, we await your formal acceptance of the Duke's generous offer. Such an alliance would bring great prosperity to both lands." Lady Beatrice, seated nearby, smiled with barely concealed triumph. "Indeed, such a match would be most fitting for one of your station." The hall grew hushed as all eyes turned to Edmund. He sat silent for a long moment, his fingers tight around his own goblet. Clara kept her gaze downward, not daring to look at him, knowing these moments would be her last in his presence. Then Edmund rose, his chair scraping against the stone floor. The candlelight caught the silver threads in his dark jacket as he stood straight and tall. His voice, when it came, rang with unexpected strength and clarity. "You speak much of lineage and wealth," he said, his eyes sweeping the assembled nobility, "of alliances and proper stations. But in these past weeks, I have witnessed something far more precious." A murmur rippled through the hall. The Duke's envoys exchanged worried glances. "I have seen true nobility," Edmund continued, "not in those who boast of ancient bloodlines, but in one whom you despise. I have watched as she served others without complaint, offered wisdom without pride, and faced scorn with grace." His gaze found Clara, who looked up at last, her heart pounding. The child within her stirred, as if sensing the gravity of the moment. "I will wed Clara," Edmund declared, his voice filling every corner of the vast hall. "For she has shown the heart of a queen." Gasps and cries of outrage erupted from the assembled nobles. Lady Beatrice's face twisted in fury, while the Duke's envoys shot to their feet, sputtering protests. Servants froze in their tracks, pitchers and platters suspended in mid-service. "Your Highness," the elder envoy managed, his face reddening. "Surely you cannot mean to throw away such an advantageous match for a woman of true worth?" Edmund cut in, his tone sharp. That is precisely what I intend. The castle. Chaplain, Father Thomas, rose from his seat near the high table. His weathered face was thoughtful as he stepped forward, hands clasped before his brown robes. "Your Highness," he said, his quiet voice somehow carrying over the commotion, "if this is your wish, I must inform you that with proper banns or a special license, such a marriage may lawfully proceed. There is no impediment in God's eyes between two Christian souls." More whispers rushed through the hall, but Edmund paid them no heed. He stepped down from the high table, his boots echoing on the stone floor as he approached Clara's seat. The crowd parted before him, creating a path through the chaos. Clara sat frozen, scarcely breathing as Edmund reached her. His face, usually so stern, had softened into an expression of tenderness she had glimpsed only in their private moments in the garden. Edmund extended his hand to her. "My lady?" Clara's fingers trembled as she placed them in his strong grasp. Edmund drew her gently to her feet, and before the entire assembled court, he raised her hand to his lips. The kiss was soft, reverent, and spoke of something far deeper than mere defiance of convention. In that moment, as Clara stood beside Edmund while nobles muttered and servants stared, she felt the truth of God's mysterious ways. From desperate plea to true love, from lowest place to highest honor, her path had led her here, to this man who saw beyond birth to the heart within. Morning sunlight streamed through the chapel's stained glass windows, casting jeweled colors across the stone floor. After 3 weeks of banns being read from the pulpit, the day of union had arrived. Clara stood before the altar in a gown of cream-colored wool, simply cut but lovingly embroidered by the castle seamstresses. Her advanced pregnancy only added to her gentle radiance. Edmund, resplendent in deep blue velvet, gazed at his bride with undisguised tenderness. The castle staff filled the back of the chapel, their faces bright with genuine joy. In the front pews, nobles sat stiffly, their expressions carefully neutral as they bowed their heads in reluctant acceptance. When the chaplain pronounced them man and wife, Edmund's kiss was both gentle and fierce with pride. He led Clara from the chapel to the great hall, where common folk had gathered to see their new princess. Their cheers echoed off the stone walls, drowning out any remaining whispers of dissent. Edmund raised Clara's hand, his voice strong and clear. "Behold your princess, chosen not for birth but for the nobility of her heart. And know that the child she carries shall be heir to my name and lands, blessed twice over by God's grace." Within days of the ceremony, Clara's time came. Edmund refused to leave her side during the birthing, kneeling in fervent prayer while midwives attended her. Through the long hours, his whispered devotions mingled with Clara's labored breathing. When their son's first cry pierced the air, Edmund's prayers turned to tears of joy. The midwives cleaned and swaddled the healthy boy before placing him in Clara's arms. Edmund gathered them both close, his heart so full it seemed it might burst. Later that evening, as the first snow of winter drifted past the castle windows, the new family stood together in the warm glow of the hearth. Edmund cradled Clara and their sleeping son, watching the white flakes dance in the darkness beyond. "My love," he whispered, pressing a kiss to her temple, "you came to these gates, begging only for shelter. Yet in your humility, you have given me far more than I ever dreamed possible, a kingdom of love itself." Clara leaned back against him, their child secure between them, as peace settled over the castle like the blanket of snow outside. Thanks for watching. If any part of this story lingered with you, consider subscribing. I'll be here again tomorrow, sharing another tale that speaks to the soul.